In this chapter, we're going to discuss the respiratory system. But before we get started, I want you to take just a moment and hold your breath. Now hold your breath as long as you can without releasing it. Don't hold it too long. I don't want you passing out. We got a lot of stuff to cover. But hold your breath. And then when you can no longer hold your breath, I want you to notice the very first thing that you do. I'll give you a few seconds. You can pause if you need to. So I'm sure many of you have started breathing again already. What was the first thing you did? Did you exhale? Did you inhale? You might have thought that you would inhale because you had to get some air into your lungs, right? But that's not what happens. Almost everyone is going to exhale first. Now let's talk a little bit and see if you can figure out why you did that. So remember, your body cells are continuously using oxygen to break down metabolic nutrients so that we can generate ATP. So these reactions, remember, are going to release carbon dioxide as a waste product during cell respiration. So if you remember, we broke down glucose and we made ATP, and in the process of all that, CO2 was a waste product that was created. So it's normal for that to happen. But an excessive amount of CO2 can produce respiratory acidosis, and that can be toxic to body cells. So excess CO2 has to be able to we have to be able to eliminate it really quickly and really efficiently. So the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system work together to supply oxygen to body tissues and to eliminate CO2. The respiratory system provides for gas exchange, so we take in oxygen and eliminate that CO2. The cardiovascular system transports blood containing the gases between the lungs and the body cells. So these two systems, the respiratory and cardiovascular, work very closely together. And if either system fails to do its job, then homeostasis is disrupted, and that can lead to rapid cell death from oxygen starvation or buildup of waste products. The respiratory system also participates in regulating blood pH, as you've just seen, right? And it contains receptors for the sense of smell, filters inspired or inhaled air, helps us to produce sounds that we use to communicate, and also helps to get rid of some water and some heat in the exhaled air. So in this chapter, we're going to learn about several of the functions of the respiratory system. We'll describe the anatomy of the respiratory system and look at how it works. How does the respiratory system do what it does? We'll talk about the events that cause us to inhale and exhale and the gas exchange, and we'll talk about how oxygen and CO2 are transported in the blood. Now, before we move any further, I want you to think back to when you held your breath a while ago and when you had to stop holding your breath. Why did you stop holding your breath? It was becoming uncomfortable, right? So you automatically went into respiratory acidosis. Now, it was a low-level acidosis because you started breathing again. Your brain has respiratory centers, and those respiratory centers trigger your body to start breathing again so that you can get rid of that CO2 and get your pH back as it should be by getting rid of that CO2. Now, we're going to talk much more about that, but I like to begin the respiratory system with that short little introductory exercise because it really explains how the respiratory system works to do many of the things that it does. All right, so let's get started. So as we're talking about the respiratory, got a little quick in the moving there. All right, so when we're talking about the respiratory system, we need to understand that there are 3 stages in what we commonly call respiration, or bringing in oxygen and removing CO2. The first step, as you see here on the diagram, is pulmonary ventilation and what we commonly call breathing. So that's inhaling or inflow of gases and exhaling outflow of gases. This involves the exchange of air between the atmosphere around us and the alveoli, or little air bags in the lungs. When we inhale, this permits oxygen to enter the lungs, and when we exhale, this permits CO2 to leave the lungs. The second step in respiration is external respiration, and that's the exchange of gases between the alveoli of the lungs and the blood in those pulmonary capillaries across what's known as the respiratory membrane. Now, you should have heard about respiratory capillaries when you learned about the pulmonary circuit in the cardiovascular system. So in this process, pulmonary capillary blood is going to pick up oxygen and drop off CO2. And the third step in respiration is internal respiration or tissue respiration. So this is the exchange of gases between blood and the systemic capillaries in the tissue cells. So blood loses oxygen and picks up CO2. So within the cells, the metabolic reactions that consume oxygen and give off CO2, remember, were what we called cell respiration. Now, that is not this pulmonary respiration that we're talking about when we're looking at gas exchange. So as we talked about, we're going to be exchanging gases between the atmosphere, the blood, and the cells. And the cardiovascular system is going to be the transport system for moving those respiratory gases. And the combination of the processes are the three steps that allow this to happen. So oxygen is inhaled into the alveolar sacs of the lungs. Then it is going to move from the lungs into the pulmonary capillaries, and that's what we call external or pulmonary expiration, or respiration, I'm sorry. So then that oxygenated blood moves through the systemic circuit, back to the left side of the heart, and out through the rest of the systemic circuit, where it reaches capillary beds in the tissues. So when we're in the tissues, oxygen is going to leave the systemic capillaries and get into the tissues, and CO2 that was building up in the tissues because of cell respiration is going to be picked up in those systemic capillaries, and now that blood carrying all of that CO2 is going to go right back to the heart and be pumped out to the lungs in that nice continuous circuit. I'm sorry, this is a new mouse and it's just very, very sensitive. Okay, so when we look at the components that make up the respiratory system, structurally, we divide the respiratory system into two separate parts, the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. Functionally, we divide the respiratory system into two zones. The conducting zone, which consists of a series of interconnecting cavities and tubes, both inside and outside the lungs. So these are going to include the nose and the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi and the bronchioles, and then the tiny little terminal bronchioles. And the function of these is to warm, filter, and moisten the air and to conduct it into the lungs. The respiratory zone is the second zone, and that consists of the tubes and the tissues within the lungs where gas exchange occurs. So these include the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveolar sacs, and the alveoli where gas exchange between the air and the blood is going to occur. In this image, you can see the upper respiratory system. It begins with the nose, so we have the external opening that is the nares, what we commonly call the nostrils. So air is going to come into the nasal cavity, then it's going to pass into the nasopharynx, or the part of the pharynx behind the nasal cavity, pass down through the oropharynx into the lower part of the pharynx, which is what we call the laryngeo or laryngopharynx. Now, the lower part of the pharynx is where the upper respiratory system stops and the lower respiratory system begins. So the lower respiratory system begins with the larynx and continues into the trachea, and then your right and left primary bronchi that are going to branch into smaller and smaller and smaller bronchioles, and the lungs themselves are part of the lower respiratory system. So before we begin a further examination of this, let's move into an examination of more of the upper respiratory system. Just do a quick overview of the structures here. Alright, so most of this you learned in your Anatomy 1 class. So here you have the external nares, which is the opening, and that air will come into the nasal cavity. You can see that this is covered with that shiny little mucous membrane. Of course, we know mucous membrane creates that sticky mucus that allows things to get trapped in there so the air is cleaned a bit before it passes further into the respiratory system. You also will notice the nasal conchae here covered by that mucous membrane, and these increase the surface area so the air stays in the nasal cavity a bit longer so that it can be cleaned and warmed and humidified as it's going to pass into the nasopharynx. So the nasopharynx is the back part of the nasal cavity where it goes into the throat. Remember, the pharynx is what we commonly call the throat. So air passes through the nares into the nasal cavity, swirl it, warm it, clean it, humidify it, and then it passes into the nasopharynx, passes through the oropharynx down to the laryngopharynx. Now, here is where we're going to end the upper respiratory tract and begin the lower respiratory tract. But before we do so, let's talk. This mouse is going to be the death of me. Let's talk a little bit more about the nose itself. So you know that the nose is an organ. It's a specialized organ that's at the entrance of the respiratory system, and it consists of a visible external portion, we commonly just call it the nose, and the internal portion that's inside the skull, and we call that the nasal cavity. So the external nose is the portion we see on the face. It consists of a framework of bone and hyaline cartilage that's covered with muscle and skin lined with a mucous membrane. The frontal bone, the nasal bone, and the maxilla all make up the bony framework of the external nose. And again, that's just a review of some things that you learned in your Anatomy 1 class. The cartilaginous framework of the external nose is several pieces of hyaline cartilage, and they're all connected to each other and also connected to some of the skull bones by some fibrous connective tissue. The external nose has two openings called the external nares, or commonly we call them nostrils, and this leads into the two cavities of the nose. So the interior structures of the external nose have three functionings. As I mentioned a while ago, warming, moisturizing, and filtering incoming air. That's one function. Detecting olfactory stimulus that translates into our sense of smell once that stimulus hits the brain. And the third function is to modify speech vibrations as they pass through large hollow resonating chambers. So resonance refers to prolonging, amplifying, or modifying a sound by vibration. So before we move past nose, let's talk a little bit about something that is pretty common, and that is a plastic surgery procedure called rhinoplasty. So rhino means thin, or rhino is thin and means nose, and plasty means to mold or shape. So a rhinoplasty, this is what we commonly call the nose job. So it's a surgical procedure where the shape of the external nose is altered, and it's often done for cosmetic reasons. However, sometimes it can be done to repair a fractured nose if you have an injury or a deviated nasal septum. So both local and general anesthetics are given, and then tools are used and inserted through the nostrils. The nasal cartilage is reshaped, and the nasal bones are fractured and repositioned to make the nose look the way you want it. So then once that is done, an internal packing and a splint are inserted into the nose to keep it in the shape that it was just created to be until it heals, so that that will be a lasting shape. Sounds pretty painful to me, guys. I don't know.